You can't handle the truth!
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Master Sergeant Albert Perez Oyola, and I am the Law Office Superintendent here at Whiteman Air Force Base. So today, what we're going to do is we're just going to talk about Article 15. We're just going to go through the process of what an Article 15 is. So let's get started. All right, so Article 15, what is in Article 15? So Article 15 comes from the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and it just happens to be Article 15. So the UCMJ, it's a little bit strange as to how it is, how it's prepared or how it's presented, right? So we've got some articles from, and I'm sure you've potentially gotten the briefing before, but articles 1 through 76 are essentially administrative articles of the UCMJ. Some examples, just to throw one out there, is Article 6 of the UCMJ. It's essentially a legal office inspection conducted by the Judge Advocate General of the Air Force. So that individual is essentially the head of the JAG Corps and is responsible for inspecting individual legal offices and other agencies. So that is just an example as to, what Article 6 being an administrative article of the UCMJ. And so Article 15 happens to fall under one of those administrative articles of the UCMJ. So it is essentially a tool for the commanders to provide swift discipline, right? Without having to take someone to a court-martial, or without that individual having the stigma of having gone through a court-martial. It doesn't provide the member essentially with a conviction, right? With a federal conviction. So it definitely saves that. And it's limited on the punishments, but there are a lot of punishments that can happen through an Article 15. But let me essentially explain the process and why it happens. So Article 15 falls on a level that for offenses that are committed, that you can't just solve an LOC with a LOA or with an LOR, right? This is for your UIF control roster. Now, this is an offense that goes above that goes beyond that and has to be punished. But it's also below where a court-martial would be. Now, I don't want to provide examples of what are typical Article 15 offenses, because they really vary, right? They vary on the frequency of the offense and the egregious, how egregious is the offense, how it obviously is serious enough that it will warrant an Article 15. But for instance, you should never see, if an individual is late for the first time, you should never see that go straight to an Article 15, right? You're not going to see that unless potentially the member just is late for a day or 2 or 3 days. Now we're looking at an Article 15, potentially a court-martial. But this is, how that thought process happens. There are some offenses that are just more impactful, or are just more serious than the ones that you would typically see in an LOC or in an LOR. How does it begin? So Article 15 is done on a specific Air Force form. So Air Force Form 3070, we have 3 versions of the Air Force Form. This is Air Force Form 3070 Alpha, there's Air Force Form 3070 Bravo, and an Air Force Form 3070 Charlie. Air Force Form Alpha is essentially for ranks of Airman Basic through Staff Sergeant. Then Air Force Form 3070B are for Tech Sergeants through Chief Master Sergeant. And then 3070 Charlie, Air Force Form 3070 Charlie, is for officer. So that's essentially the 3 forms that are utilized to initiate and to actually complete the full Article 15. So it starts with the commander of the member. So it has to be the commander who initiates. The commander of the member will offer, through this Air Force Form 3070, the Article 15 to the member, essentially putting them on notice that they are considering punishing the member through Article 15. And that member at that point in time has 3 duty days to make some important decisions, right? So the decisions, 3 duty days that need to be addressed or that need to be done by the member within those 3 duty days is to potentially, whether or not to go see an attorney. Now, should the member see an attorney? Yes. And typically, even in the form, you can see on the 3070, there is a spot for the commander or the first sergeant or the unit to schedule an ADC or Area Defense Council appointment. So that is already made and prepared for you should you choose to take the appointment. And obviously, most recommended avenue out there is that the member does, exercise and does seek counsel for Article 15 purposes. One is consulting the ADC or not consulting the ADC. Second is whether or not the member or the individual is going to accept the form of the Article 15. It's not that you're saying that you're guilty. It's not that you're saying that you're accepting the Article 15. What you're accepting is the form. And if you don't accept the form of an Article 15, you decline it, which means is that you're now going to go to a court martial. You will go either to a summary court martial or a special court, depending on who the individual is. If it's an officer who's declining the Article 15, more than likely will go to a general court martial. And we can go about explain the court martial process in the 3 different courts at a later time. But essentially, within the Article 15, it can be turned down. But what it means is that you're now going to go to a court martial, and that's the forum that you rather go to instead of an Article 15. Now, what are the benefits of accepting the Article 15? Which again, doesn't mean that you're accepting or saying that you're guilty. So the punishments are limited, right? It's a commander who's going to ultimately make the decision as to whether or not you're guilty of any specific offense. And also, if found guilty, the commander is the one who's going to decide on punishment. If the member decides to turn down the Article 15 and go to a court martial, then obviously the punishments are a lot larger at that point. You're risking federal conviction and other potential punishments and consequences that come with being court martialed. And so that's just that decision. But if the member decides to say, okay, I accept NJP proceedings, then there's 2 more decisions that need to be made, and that is whether or not the individual presented matters, written matters, and also number 4 is whether or not the member wants to have a personal appearance with the commander to plead their case. And they can decline the personal appearance, or they can say, I want the personal appearance to be private, or I want the personal appearance to be made public. So those are the other decisions that need to be made. Once the commander has everything, that we're written presentation and potentially a personal appearance, then the commander will decide whether or not the member, or if the member was guilty and NJP will proceed, or whether or not the member was not guilty, or that NJP is not the proper form for this situation. So that is how the beginning part of the Article 15 works. So once that decision has been made, that the member is guilty and NJP will go on, now where it goes is punishment. So punishment really depends on 2 things, right? The rank of the member and the rank of the commander. So that is going to, a lot of things are going to depend on that. If the commander is a captain or below, then they are limited on what type of punishment they're going to get. Right? So the punishment for a captain or below, as far as maximum punishment that they can provide, they can reduce a staff sergeant, but they cannot reduce a tech sergeant or a master sergeant in rank. They can give 14 days restriction, 14 days extra duties, only 7 days pay, a reprimand, and that is about just the basics. And there are others, but these are the ones that essentially a captain or below can do. A major, can demote a tech sergeant, not a master sergeant. So that's a big difference there. And now as far as the other punishments, we're talking about forfeiture of pay of half month's pay for 2 months, up to 2 months. That's the maximum punishment. 45 days extra duty, 45 days restriction. If both are going to be given, right? So 45 days restriction. However, if there are no extra duties, you can do 60 days restriction. But if the commander is going to do extra duties and restriction, it's only limited to 45 and 45. Again, we mentioned the reduction, the reprimand. Again, lieutenant colonel can the punish to the for a major is similar. But the lieutenant colonel can actually reduce a master sergeant in rank. So that is the big difference. But as far as the other punishments, they're the same. Once punishment is given, the punishment takes effect right then and there. So essentially, once the commander says, you've been punished and you're being reduced now to, say, reduced from staff sergeant to senior airman, the member will start, the date of rank will be that day where that happens, and the member will start wearing those stripes. However, there is the member does have 5 calendar days to potentially appeal the punishment or appeal the non-judicial punishment to the higher level authority, who will look at the evidence and make a decision as to whether or not to grant that appeal. The member can appeal part of the punishment, the full punishment and the full NJP. And then it'll be up to the higher level authority. If it was a squadron commander who served the Article 15, then it's going to be a group commander who's the appellate authority. If it was a group commander who initiated the Article 15, it'll be the wing commander, appellate authority, so on and so forth. So once the 5 calendar days have elapsed, the member chooses to appeal or not, then we essentially get into closing the Article 15 and whether or not the UIF whether or not a UIF will be established in the member's record, which there are some mandatory UIFs within Article 15. So if the punishment is, lasts 30 days or longer, then that's automatic UIF. And then it closes. That's after, in the form that is it. It's done. There are other actions which are called supplementary actions that can be taken within 4 months of when the Article 15 was closed. And those are remission, mitigation, set aside, and suspension. I had to think about that last one, but yeah, so essentially remission, mitigation, set aside, suspension. Those are the 4 supplementary actions that can be taken post the Article 15. So if later on the commander finds that perhaps new evidence came to light that further corroborated or explained what the member was trying to say initially, some new evidence that it wasn't there before, then the commander within 4 months can set aside the whole Article 15 as if never happened. There are other areas where perhaps the commander thinks that the punishment was too harsh initially to begin with, or maybe the suspension in rank was perhaps too much. So then they can switch the rank to mitigate rank for forfeitures. So say if someone was reduced from tech sergeant to staff sergeant, then they can say, all right, instead of taking disruption, I'm just going to take some money and mitigate it that way. Can only mitigate down, or can't mitigate, or right. It wouldn't be mitigation if instead of forfeitures, they're like, I'm going to take a stripe instead, because taking the stripe is seen as the harsher punishment. There's also suspension, right? So if stripe was taken, and then the member for whatever reason is showing, but some typical scenarios is the member is showing great improvement and perhaps doing things to brief other airmen as to not do what they did, are just doing great and amazing work in the work center, then perhaps the commander can consider suspending the stripe, which will provide the stripe back to the member, but the member will be in a probation period for another 6 months. And if that probation period expires, then they just get to keep the stripe. So there are other things that can happen post Article 15. Definitely, as the member with those rights, so recommend that the member sees the consults with the Area Defense Council to see what options are available to them. But this is essentially the basics of an Article 15 process. If you have any questions at all whatsoever about the Article 15 process, you can go ahead and give us a call. Give us a call at the legal office. We'll be glad to help you out with any questions that you may have. However, if you happen to be going through the Article 15 process yourself, do not call us. Please contact your Area Defense Council. Sounds good? All right, Wyman. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned some things about the Article 15 process. Have a great day.